The Florida Joint Center for Citizenship presents Federalism. When the framers wrote the U.S. Constitution, they knew that they wanted the federal government to be stronger than it had been under the Articles of Confederation. So in this video, we're going to explore how the Constitution improved on the Articles of Confederation through the system of federalism. In this video, we'll be able to define the concept of federalism, compare concurrent, enumerated, reserved, and delegated powers, and we will also be able to understand how federalism limits government power. So let's begin. By defining our terms, and of course the most important term is federalism. Federalism is the idea that power is shared between the national or federal government and the state governments to keep either the national or the state governments from getting too powerful. To define the powers between the national and state governments, the Constitution includes three types of powers. We have enumerated or delegated powers, concurrent powers, and reserved powers. So enumerated or delegated powers are the powers granted to the federal or national government. Let's take a look at some examples of these. For example, the U.S. government can raise and support an army or a navy. It can declare war, and it can make treaties, all granted under the U.S. Constitution. So what about those powers that are reserved or set aside only for the states by the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? You might be familiar with a couple of these powers. For example, only the states can run elections, and only the states can set up or run schools. Finally, we have concurrent powers, which are powers shared between the states and the federal government. According to the Constitution, both the states and the federal government can tax the people and borrow money. We've learned a lot so far, so let's check in and see what we know. Try to answer each of the following questions in your own words. How does federalism divide the power of government? Federalism divides the power of government by giving some powers to states, some powers to the federal government, and some powers to both. What is the difference between reserved and enumerated powers? Reserved powers are the powers that belong only to the states, while enumerated powers belong only to the federal government. Remember, with federalism, it's all about limits. Power is shared between the national federal government and the states in order to limit the power of both under our Constitution. For example, only the federal government can make treaties, which is an enumerated power. But remember, in the system of federalism, states have powers too. For example, only states get to decide whether citizens have to be registered to vote before Election Day. According to the Constitution, though, both the states and the federal government also have some powers in common. For example, both have the power to tax citizens. These are called concurrent powers because they have the power at the same time and both can use that power. Well, we've learned a lot so far throughout this video, so let's do a quick check-in. See if you can answer the following question. Give an example of an enumerated power and a reserved power. We've learned a lot about these types of powers so far. Remember, enumerated powers for the federal or national government include the power to make treaties, form an army or navy, or declare war, while reserved powers for the states include the power to create schools and the power to control elections. But aren't there times when Congress might use powers that are not specifically listed or enumerated in the U.S. Constitution? Oh, definitely. For example, one of Congress's enumerated powers is to raise and support armies. To help with this during times of war, Congress has sometimes passed a law that requires people to join the military, called a draft. The creation of a draft is not an enumerated power of Congress, but it does fall under what is called the Necessary and Proper Clause of the U.S. Constitution. The Necessary and Proper Clause says that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So let's see if we can break down that complicated text from the Constitution into some simpler terms. The Necessary and Proper Clause basically means that Congress might need other powers so it can exercise the powers it has been given. These are called implied powers because the Constitution implies that Congress has that ability. Remember, too, the states have power as well under the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. For example, under the 10th Amendment, Public education is a state power, so only states can create public schools. Remember that under federalism, each state does have its own laws and its own constitution. But ultimately, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This is found in the Constitution under the Supremacy Clause. So let's talk about the Supremacy Clause. So the Supremacy Clause states that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. That's pretty complicated. So what does this mean? So put simply, the Supremacy Clause means that no state can pass laws or do anything that violates the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution is supreme over state constitutions and laws, and that is at the heart of federalism. So let's recap and see what we learned. Try to answer each of the following questions in your own words. How does federalism limit the power of the national or federal government in the United States? So, federalism limits the power of the national or federal government in the U.S. by dividing power between the states and the federal government. So the national government has some powers, enumerated, states have some powers, reserved, and some powers are shared between the states and the federal government, concurrent. Let's try another. How does the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution limit the power of state governments? The Supremacy Clause limits the power of states by making sure that all state laws and constitutions don't go against the U.S. Constitution and law. Ultimately, federalism is a system that is intended to make sure that power is shared between the federal and state governments to best serve the people. It balances control between the federal government and the states and creates a stronger and better system of government for us all. This video was created by the staff of the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship. Thanks for watching.